Hello everyone, it's Karen and welcome to part 2 of the Roy Orbison career review. We've gone over quite a lot so far, hence why I've made it into a multi-part like I done with the Beatles video. I've already explained a lot in part 1, but if you missed that and want to check that out, then you can do so, which will be the previous video. So we left off the things with the success of Pretty Woman. That was a huge hit. All seemed to be well for Roy's life, but in reality it was a different picture behind the scenes. Even though Roy had a successful song, his marriage to Claudette had disintegrated, and they both had gotten divorced after the success of that song in the October of 1964. She got custody of their 2 sons and moved to Pasadena, Texas, where her mum and dad lived. And Roy was really he never really recovered from that split, and he would visit her whenever he could. And they still remained close friends during that period. And it was she then announced that she and Roy were expecting their 3rd child in May. But Roy, soldiered on nonetheless and kept going with the music. And he and Bill Dees wrote some new songs. And at the start of 1965, Roy was back in the studio recording his next single, released a few weeks later, which was called Good Night, which is another Orbison and Bill Dees composition. And that's a good song. But in terms of success, it didn't really do as well as Pretty Woman. It peaked at number 21 in the US and number 14 in the UK, which I don't think is bad, but it wasn't as big as Pretty Woman was. But I think it's a really good song, and it's one that doesn't really get talked about as often, but I think it's a really, really good song. It's one I really like. And but also at this time, Roy was in the middle of another dispute, this time with his manager and producer. Wesley Rose and Fred Foster, despite Roy's success, had never really got along. They were beginning to clash more ferociously than ever of the choice of songs he was to record. The disagreements went back to like 1959 with Uptown, especially when Roy and Fred set about recording songs that Wesley Rose and Acuff Rose did not control the publishing to. And Wesley was now by this point taking over Roy's career as a manager and was making it no surprise. And Roy's contract with Monument was to come to an end in the June of 1965, and Wesley Rose made it no surprise secret that he was wanting Roy to off Monument once the contract expired. He said to Fred Foster, under the contract you have 4 more songs to record with Roy. I'm going to tell you what you're going to record, when you're going to record, and when you're going to release it. And Wesley also wanted that the new contract include a guarantee of $1 million, 20 primetime television appearances, and a film deal, because Roy was wanting to do a bit of acting, much like what Elvis had did. And Fred was quite happy to pay the $1 million, but he didn't have a film studio, and therefore couldn't guarantee him a film deal. And because Roy had a lot of hit records, it was he felt it was Wesley's responsibility as his manager to pick up the phone and get Roy the television appearances and book them, something he knew he could easily do. And Wesley Rose was sort of producing the session, but Fred Foster was still credited on the single label. Roy wasn't too pleased with it, but he didn't have much time to worry about it, because Roy then went back on tour, this time in Australia and New Zealand, his first tour of Australia and New Zealand, and this time he was supported by another British up-and-coming band, the Rolling Stones, who are another great band that I really like. They played in Australia, and Bill Wyman has said that it was his first time tour of Australia, and there was a lot of mixed response because they were all like Roy fans. They didn't know who the Stones were yet, Roy was top of the bill on this tour, and it wasn't a problem for the Stones because they went out with other people who were top of the bill, and they just wiped them off stage. And the Stones had never been to Australia, much like Roy. And but Roy had remembered years later that the Stones had taken "Can't Get No Satisfaction" as an inspiration from Pretty Woman. They really liked the song, and they liked it well enough, right enough to go. And they had the same kind of setup with the intro, drums, guitar riff intro, and So yeah, Roy and the Stones became good friends on that tour, and Roy remembered that tour with great fondness. There was a little funny story that happened where Mick Jagger said to Roy, "I'll do the worst song I've ever recorded if you do the worst." And so Roy went and sang Ooby Dooby, which he hadn't done. But Mick Jagger and the Stones didn't do what they were going to do. But it was the first time Roy had sang Ooby Dooby on stage. But at the end of the tour, Roy got a silver cigarette case, and it says, "To Ooby Dooby from the Rolling Stones, 1965. So Roy and the Stones were quite good friends. And then Roy went on tour in England to promote the single Goodnight, and Roy went on tour, his first tour of Europe as well, including shows in Paris, France and Stockholm, and even did a concert in Holland, which was filmed for a television show, which is available on like YouTube, and also available in various formats, including this compilation, which we'll touch on later on. So Roy's third son, Wesley, who was probably named after his manager, was born in May of 1965, and Roy was about for Wesley, and him and Claudette kind of started to see each other a bit more again, and they discussed about getting back together, and discussed remarrying. But Roy had to go back to Nashville in the June of 1965 to go into the studio for what would be his last Monument session for a long time, and the final single they recorded was "Say You're My Girl," another Roy Orbison Bill Dees composition, and it's a really good song. It wasn't that successful, unfortunately. It reached number 23 in the UK and number 34 in the US, so a bit of a disappointment for Roy's last Monument single. But I think it's a great song. You know, the fact that some things didn't chart isn't bad, but to me, they're good songs. I just don't understand. But I think by this point in time that there was a new music trend happening. The British invasion was taking over, and American rock and rollers were now considered irrelevant and old hat. And Roy was probably heading in that direction, who knows. But a good song, "Say You're My Girl," which was released in July of 1965. And then Roy signed his MGM contract. MGM were a big company, and Roy went on to scrap that. But so Roy then went on to a new company after the release of the single. He went to MGM, which means Metro Goldwyn Mayer. MGM were a very successful film and music company. They had done films, they had done music, so they were a very, very big company. And so they offered Roy They offered Roy a deal of $1 million, and so Roy signed the contract with a 20-year contract for $1 million with MGM. And London Decca, who had been releasing stuff for Roy as far back as 1960, would continue to release the MGM records internationally. And within a couple of days of signing the contract, Roy went into the studio and recorded his first MGM album. Within a week, he had his first album complete and recorded, and it was released in the August of 1965, called "There Is Only One Roy Orbison." I think they called it that because Monument were releasing some like leftover material around about this time, so they called it that, I think, for that reason, and also because, you know, Roy Orbison, there was only one Roy Orbison. There was a single released from this album called "Ride Away," which was only a modest response. It reached number 25 in the US and number 34 in the UK. But Billboard gave it an enthusiastic review, saying, "Making his debut on the MGM label, Orbison has a winner in a driving piece of material that moves from start to finish with a strong dance beat." This was kind of like the start of Roy's declining a bit, and he had like, when you think about the hit of "Pretty Woman," and then all of a sudden he's starting to go down a bit in terms of charts positions and record sales, you start to wonder. But I think this is a really good, strong album. I really like "Ride Away," "You Fool You," "This Is Your Song," "I'm in a Blue Blue Mood," which was a song that Roy had left over from Monument, because I think Roy had tried to suggest this to Fred Foster, but Fred's like, "No, we've just had a few songs with Blue in the charts this week. We can't really have that," so that wasn't released. Claudette, he revisited Claudette, which was a song that he done with the Everly Brothers, as we said. "Afraid to Sleep's considered a fan favourite, it's one of mine. "Summer Love's" a really good soft ballad, and "Wandering's" a really good one. So, a good strong debut in the MGM era. So good start to the MGM era. And then Roy then went on his first tour to Ireland in the July of 1965, and the CDs for the MGM years I'm going to be showing are from this box set, the MGM years, which I've done an actual video on, so if you want to see me talk about them in more detail, you can do that. But around about this time, Monument started to release a lot of like leftover material they had that was not issued at the time, and they released a song called The Good Times Roll, which Billboard gave it good, but this was the start of a long running feud between Roy's old label Monument and MGM. But there's only one Roy Orbison was released in number 55, and it reached number 10 in the UK. And so Roy's albums did chart in the UK as well, in the US, which I should have probably touched on in part 1, but I didn't. But by 1965 it was sort of difficult, you know, and it was kind of difficult because things were kind of changing in the music business, as we said earlier. But Roy said in the line notes on MGM, this was all artists, writers and painters and musicians need a climate of freedom in which to work. They need time to think and feel and plan. They need time to contemplate the directions their careers are going to take. They need a climate of freedom of which will allow them to expand and develop new ideas and concepts. This is exactly my kind of freedom my signing with MGM Records will allow me as an artist. And also about this time, Roy was like in the studio again in the October of 65 recording the second MGM album, and the second single, Crawling Back, which was released, which had been recorded I think for the sessions of this album, was issued in 1965 in the October, which would be the lead way for his next album. But before that, Monument had released a compilation album titled Orbisons, which is a mix of songs that weren't on albums and a mix of songs hadn't been issued, like another one called I Get So Sentimental, which is a good song. And there's also an alternate version of Dance as well, with different lyrics, which had been on the Crying album. So this was released in the November of 1965, but again, wouldn't be issued in the UK until after Roy had left Monument. And it was actually issued when Roy had left Monument in November of 65. So, yeah, a good compilation album. Again, one that you only have for the collection. And then Roy and Claudette had been sort of seen together by this point, and they remarried in the December of 1965 by this point, and then Roy recorded released the next MGM album in January 1966 called The Orbison Way. And again, another really strong album with the hit single Crawling Back and another single called Breaking Up Is Breaking My Heart, which was again a modest one. The Orbison Way, again another really good album. I really like this one quite a bit. It continued the nice and easy style of Roy's first of the previous album. And then they were great album nonetheless. What I like, Crawling Back, It Ain't No Big Thing, Time Changed Everything, The Loner, Maybe, Breaking Up Is Breaking My Heart, Go Away, A New Start, It Wasn't Very Long Ago. All great songs. Some songs have a string arrangement, but some have accompaniment with Roy's backing band at the time, who were called the Candymen, probably named after Roy's song that was issued as a single. Sorry, issued as the B-side for Crying, so probably named after that song. And so in March of 1966, Roy went on tour in the UK, where he appeared on the Sunday night at London Palladium. And during that tour, he was appearing on a bill with the Walker Brothers, and then he was taking part in a motorcycle race in Shropshire, in Hawkstone Park in Shropshire, and they went on a motorbike ride. But during the race, Roy got in hit a sand pit, fell off the motorbike and injured his ankle, and he ended up having to do the tour sat down on a stool in a plaster cast on his foot. And Claudette heard about this, and she was worried about Roy, and she immediately went to England to be with him. And the public were now aware of the fact that Roy and Claudette were back together. But around about that time, Roy celebrated his 30th birthday, and was doing a concert at the Hammersmith in Odeon, and the fan club surprised him by having a little 30th birthday party, which was really cool. And then during that, Roy had issued a new single called Twinkle Toes, which was a up-tempo tune, but it was another hit over here. And Roy then appeared on at the NME Paul Winner's concert in 1966, which the Beatles appeared on. That would be their last UK appearance of the Beatles. And then Roy was around at this time was recording the next album, which was released in July of 1966, called The Classic Roy Orbison. This album has it's got a mix of upbeat, up-tempo, and really got a mix of everything, really. But this album didn't chart in the US, it only peaked at number 12 in the UK, which is a good number, not bad. But I like You'll Never Be 16 Again, Twinkle Toes, Losing You, No I'll Never Get Over You, Just Another Name for Rock and Roll, and Never Love Again is a good one. Really good album, I would say. This was released in the July of 66, but before that happened, tragedy was to strike Roy for the first time when he and Claudette were riding home from a motorcycle drag race weekend in June of 1966, and they were on their way back from it when a pickup truck pulled out in front of Claudette and she was killed almost instantly. And Roy, this was a huge blow for Roy, and he was now left with 3 boys to look after on his own. But he knew he kind of had to keep going and had to go back to work. He then, during this point, had his first film and was in the process of about to star in his first film, which he'd always wanted to do. He wanted to be a bit of an actor, much like what people like James Dean and Elvis. In fact, Roy often went to a film if he wasn't on tour. If he had a day off, he would go and see a film. And Roy liked Hollywood and was really into acting, and so we'll touch on that film in a few minutes. But Roy had released Monument had issued the single Lana, and also issued this compilation around that time called The Very Best of Roy Orbison. This, as it says in the tin, best of, again for the collection, but it's a good one to have. It's one I like to listen to from time to time. But then MGM eventually decided, and they also issued Lana as a single, which I forgot to bring up, but here you go, but I do have that as a single. And then MGM said that was the last straw and basically filed a lawsuit against Monument, and Monument basically they had an agreement that they would not release any Orbison material for 5 years, so that was kind of it. And then Too Soon to Know was issued as a single in 1966, in the July of August of 66. It peaked number 68 in the US, number 3 in the UK. Roy told the NME, I didn't really want to go into the studio and record something new, so I just said, release whatever you think is best, and that was the song that Wesley Rose picked. And he became criticised for releasing that song so soon after his tragic event. But I really like the song. I think it's a really good song. And around about the same time that Roy was working on his film, he had been recording material of a singer-songwriter called Don Gibson, and the album was this, called Roy Orbison Sings Don Gibson. It's not a bad album. It's quite good. I like all the songs. And Don Gibson was sort of similar to Roy. He was songs of kind of sorrow and lost love and all that. And a pretty good album. It's not one I've heard in a long time, but it's one I definitely need to give another listen. I like I'd Be a Legend of My Time, which he done on Lonely and Blue, Sweet Dreams, Oh Such a Stranger, Blue Blue Day, Too Soon to Know, and Lonesome Number 1. So not a bad album, I would say. Released in the January of 1967. And also, as we said around about that time, Roy was in the process of starring in his first film, and this rumour was allegedly a film that Elvis had turned down. It's rumoured, I don't know if it's true or not, but I did hear that somewhere. And it was released in 1967, around about the summer, called The Fastest Guitar Alive. But before that, Roy had issued a song called Communication Breakdown as a single, which didn't really do anything, then released So Good in 1967, and a good up-tempo song I like. And B-side was Memories, which would later be on the next LP. But Fastest Guitar Alive was like a western, and they were originally going to do this film as a serious film, but then Cat Ballou, I think, was a comedy, and that won an Academy Award in that year. So they decided they would have a funny western, and Roy spent a lot of time in Hollywood filming the film. And when it premiered, and Roy got a telegram from Colonel Parker and Elvis wishing him the best of luck. And unfortunately, the film was not a commercial or a critical success. It stiffed at the box office. I haven't seen the film, so I personally can't comment. But the soundtrack album's actually pretty good. Whirlwind I like Fastest Guitar Alive, Pistolero, Best Friend, and The One Minute Coming Home, which were the 2 songs that Roy had written before the film was changed. and There Won't Be Many Coming Home was released as a single in America, in the UK, but it wasn't issued in America, as it was believed it would be kind of misinterpreted for Vietnam that was going on at the time. And Roy was also touring again in the UK and Australia. He toured again with who did he tour with in '67? Not too sure who he toured with at this time, but I know he went back on the road in '67 with the Small Faces, I think, and in Britain, and toured Australia with the Yardbirds and Jimmy Page. And then Roy recorded his next album, which is called Cry Softly Lonely One, in the October of 1967. And I love this cover with a great picture of Roy with the car. Roy had a thing for like very old-fashioned retro cars, but I like She, which was a single, and Cry Softly Lonely One, which was a single. Communication Breakdown, that was also a single. It Takes One to Know One, That's a No-No. Memories, Time to Cry, and Only Alive is a really good song. So yeah, another really good album. But this would be the problem with the problems would start with Roy's global albums. They started to become a bit messy. This, despite having 3 hit singles, was not issued in Australia. So why that was the case, I don't know. So yeah, this is where things started to really get kind of messy for Roy on the global basis, because his records would not come out in that country because this was not released in Australia or New Zealand, even though it had 3 top hit singles. So yeah, why that was, I don't know, but a good album nonetheless, and one I really like a lot. Haven't heard it for a long time, so I definitely need to give it another listen. And then remember at that time in 1968, after that film, they were going to do, I think, another film, but then they scrapped that, and Roy then went into the studio and continued to record, but his records struggled to sell as well as they once had. But he did record a song called Walk On, and the reason why I'm showing this one is because even though this would later be on an album, it's a MGM special disc jockey record from 1968. Wow, that's really cool to own. And Back with Flowers is the B-side. So 1968, Roy went back on tour in the UK in the summer of 1968, and it was during that tour, after a concert at Batley Variety Club, Roy would meet his second wife, who would become his second wife, called Barbara, who was a German-born who'd moved to England for a few years. But she and Roy both hit it off and fell in love, and so yeah, things seemed to be looking up for Roy again after what had happened over the last couple of years, and his reviews and performances were getting great reviews. Even though he wasn't selling that many records, people were still turning out to his concerts, which was good to see, you know. And he then, in September of 1968, was nearing the end of his tour, and after some shows in Birmingham, more tragedy was to hit Roy. He got the news that his home in Hendersonville had burned down, and he'd lost his 2 eldest sons in the fire. But his parents and Wesley had survived. It was a great awful loss for Roy, so he ended up really kind of going into withdrawal and not really doing anything in 1968, and took the rest of the year off. But he just released a single, Heartache, which kind of ironic timing really. But friends and family did rally around and try and help Roy, particularly Johnny Cash, who had known Roy for years, helped Roy and talked to him, and one of Roy's guitarists from Monument came and saw him, and during that period, and Roy gave Roy a guitar as a sort of like just to say sorry about what happened, and that I think really helped Roy a bit. But remember that time, Barbara, who Roy had met on the tour, and Roy did speak during that period, and then she helped him through his grief and his loss, and they eventually ended up remarrying in the March of 1969. So things were looking up for Roy again, and then in May of 1969, Roy released this album, Many Moods, and this is one of my favourite Roy albums. I really like this one a lot. Truly, Truly True, his version of the Righteous Brothers, Unchained Melody, Heartache, Amy, Good Morning Dear, What Now My Love, Walk On, which was a hit, and Try to Remember is a great closer. So I think I would say I'm more of a fan of side 2 than side 1, but both are great. Again, this is where things get a bit messy. Walk On and Heartache were UK top 40 singles, and they weren't released in Britain. Why that was the case, I don't know. But so yeah, things get even more complicated on a global basis by this point. But again, a great album, one that I really like a lot. So yeah, great album. And the end of the 60s really kind of... And also Roy released a single in 1969 titled My Friend, which is another great song. And the B-side was a really long kind of song called Southbound Jericho Parkway, which was almost like, kind of like a mini opera. It told parts of a story, in a sense. And but My Friend peaked at number 35. But Southbound Jericho Parkway, I think, was a hit in Australia. But I think radio stations didn't really play it because it was 7 minutes. So Roy was trying to do something a bit different, a bit experimental, like what everyone was doing at this time. But I'm not saying it didn't work. It just didn't really grab people's attention, really. But it's not a bad song. I like it. And but I do prefer the A-side, My Friend. But I think in America they switched about the single for some reason. And things get even further complicated when this album came out in March of 1970, The Big O. And again, another one of my favourite Roy albums. I like this one a lot. But this had intended to be a live album. Roy wanted to do a live album during his UK tour of 1969, record at Batley Variety Club and do an album called Roy Orbison Live in England. But MGM, for whatever reason, didn't want to do the live record, or didn't want to put it out the live record, and he ended up having to compromise. And so what they did was they turned Batley Variety Club into a recording studio. Him and his backing band, by this point, who were called the Art Movement, recorded in Batley Variety Club, turned it into a recording studio, and recorded this album. But what makes matters worse was that MGM decided not to release the album in America, but London and Decca and London in other parts of the world want to release it. So that ended up coming out. And but again, a great album. I like some of these songs that Roy did on the 1969 tour. You've got Break My Mind, Help Me Rhonda, his version of The Platters' Only You, Money, When I Stop Dreaming, Love in Touch, Scarlet Ribbons, and Penny Arcade, which was a big hit in the UK and Australia. That Roy had recorded in the July of 1969, and when released the following month it was another hit. And it would be his last sort of big UK top 40 for 16 UK chart entry for 16 years. So yeah, things were really kind of, you don't know what's happening with the global records. And so but again, great album, The Big O, one that I really like a lot. And then later on in 1970, Roy changed his hair and he's now got a different appearance. And this version, Hank Williams of Roy Orbison, which was released in August 1970, was only ever available in the US, and there wasn't a single off it. But this is one I don't have on vinyl as of yet, but I'm still going to get it one day. It's an album that I don't really know that well. I need to kind of listen again. I liked Hey Good Looking, Jambalaya, Last Night I Heard You Crying in Your Sleep, and A Mansion on the Hill, and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. So, but it's not bad. He recorded this in March of 1969 over a 3 sessions, so it was kind of quick. And but not a bad album, but I just, again, one that I need to listen to quite a bit and listen to again. So by 1970, Roy was still enjoying international success with his tours and concerts, but his records were struggling to sell over in America. And then in 1970, in October, Roy and Barbara had their first child. It was a son, Roy Jr. And so things seemed to be up for Roy. Roy appeared on the Johnny Cash Show in 1969 and 1970 a few times. And was still and Roy had this bet with his wife that if it was a boy, he would get to name the child, and if it was a girl, she would name it. And Roy won the bet and he got to name the son. And so Roy seemed to be looking up, and Roy had contributed to a couple of films. He had done So Young for the film Zabriskie Point, and It Takes All Kind of People was a song that he did for, I think, for The Moonshine War or Kelly's Heroes, one of the two. But Roy went on tour again in Britain and was still doing well. Even though the reviews of Hank Williams and Roy Orbison were favourable, there was the heavily orchestrated and rushed recording stiff with the public, and the fact that Decca weren't paying Roy for his global recordings and that there was no US distribution didn't help with that either. And but then in 1971, Roy was touring again and recorded another single called Love Me Like You Did It Last Night on the MGM label. even though that was an up-tempo, catchy, contemporary tune, it didn't make the charts when released in August. Even though contemporaries like by this point, the Beatles had broken up, Elvis was back, and Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones were enjoying enormous chart success. Roy was struggling to really make any success, as we said earlier, and especially commercially in the United States. But even though live audiences would remain faithful and come to his concerts whenever he could, and but his personal life was doing well as well, and so yeah. But then 1972, Roy went on another big challenge for him. He went on his first international tour, and he went to places like Europe, Japan, Australia, and America, Taiwan, Manila, Switzerland, all those places. And during his tour of Australia, he recorded a concert for television, Orbison Live in Australia, which was released on DVD. And the songs in here are really good, like the hits, but there's also cover versions, like he does Land of a Thousand Dances, which was a live staple in his shows, Sweet Caroline, which is Neil Diamond, Bridge Over Troubled Water, which Simon and Garfunkel did and Elvis did as well. So a good concert. I saw this on television on Sky Arts when I was getting into Roy back in 2009, and I enjoyed it. Haven't seen it in years. I definitely need to give it another watch sometime, which I'll probably do sometime. But yeah, really good concert, and yeah, always doing well for Roy at this point. This is a personal point of view. So that'll do part 2. What I'll do is I'll stop here and I'll go back and I'll do part 3. So we've gone from 1965 into like 1972. So we'll pick up in 1972 later on and do the later years. So we'll see then.